You know, same symptom, balsamic. And, I mean, look at all the counseling I've done, 20,000. That's a lot of culmination.
You're really cleaning up.
You know, and thank God it could be done in a professional setting versus... Get worn out the other way.
That's a very good point, then, that we could counsel people that, you know, it doesn't have to be in personal relationships.
In most cases, it can be done over a cup of coffee. And most people, because they feel the old connections, they want to do what they did before. But it's really not necessary in most cases.
In this phase, would you reach a point then to where new people are beginning to come in as you're culminating with people from the past?
Yes.
That recognition of, oh gosh, there isn't that same kind of karmic pull there. This feels new, this feels...
Yeah, but the person's never allowed to really form a real relationship at that time. That's just God showing what is ahead of the person, what is to come. And God does that intentionally. It's like putting out a carrot in front of the horse in order to keep the person primarily motivated to keep living. There's a promise out there.
Substantial relationship?
I'm sorry?
Can you ever have a substantial relationship with like that?
Sure, it's possible to have very substantial relationships.
Well, that's where I've gotten desperate sometimes, just because I keep meeting all these people and get so exhausting, and after a while it's like...
But in the end, it is another soul whose structure is the same as your own. So... So then by the time you hit to the course of balsamic conjunction, that is absolute culmination. Absolute culmination.
Because you said that most people in the balsamic phase, especially when it's like about relationship, Martinez, balsamic, they tend to repeat the same pattern as they've been behaving in previous incarnation with other souls. So let's say they jump into bed again, do the same kind of... What happens then? What's the effect?
That's the culmination, to bring it to a head.
So it will be culminated.
Yeah, because in that scenario, the person ends up getting so sick and tired of doing the same thing over and over. It's the sick and tiredness that culminates it. It's sort of like if I have to train a puppy to go outside. It gets sick and tired of having its... So it finally goes outside.
It's the people you have unresolved issues with?
Huh?
Unresolved issues.
That's the intent of the culmination, to finish business. Did I say that requires, obviously, a certain degree of awareness to know just that fact. Most people in this condition don't have the awareness. And when you have the awareness of what is actually culminating, for what reasons, then you can cooperate with that.
So if a person, like, you met one of those people, say, or you like going through this life and you didn't, it's just you descended up to something, you didn't resolve anything, you're going to meet them again?
Mm-hmm. That's the beauty of balsamic, so to speak. How many of you have balsamic planets here? Well, then you should probably know exactly what I'm talking about. Okay, so...
So just the experience of balsamic conjunction.
The experience of it? It's just the absolute intensification of what I've just said. It's the absolute awareness things are creating and awareness, a sense of being locked to a life experience that you can't really change because of the requirement of culmination, and yet sensing the seeds of what's to come, i.e. the next cycle, and in many cases trying to move towards that only to feel thwarted and then thrown back into what must be culminated. Frustration level that never increases, and so on.
So do they get that back and forth thing also, that people moving forward and
Yeah, because the movement now is towards this new cycle. And it operates very instinctually. So now what we have is an entire context, i.e. 0 to 360, in which to understand the sequential development in consciousness, evolutionarily speaking, and also a context in which to understand the of aspects. And what you know is that the aspects within phases only accentuate the actual phase itself relative to the archetype of the specific aspect. And so because most astrologers time understanding that. You have to understand the entire context. That's what this has been for. This gives you another way of understanding aspects. So, any questions on this?
We yesterday how to relate aspects and phases to the ascendant, for example. For example, if you have a planet in the first house, the quality of this planet is totally new.
It's under the impulse of a new evolutionary cycle, yeah.
You look at the phase because the ascendant is moving faster. You are in the balsamic phase. And I really have a problem to get that connected.
Well, all you do is put in your head something's culminating, something new is beginning. And it happens at the same time. And culminating something, you become aware of a new direction to take.
Yeah.
That's how it manifests in the house.
And how I have problems since the ascendant has the quality of being just instinctive and being new also. I have problems how to interpret the ascendant as balsamic quality.
Because you can instinctually initiate experiences that the very intent of which is to culminate, and you're doing this instinctually. Okay. And then the person typically would go, why did I do that? That would be the effect.
Is there a sense of grief associated with the balsamic?
Yes. Sorrow is about.
Sorrow?
Often feeling victimized sometimes by circumstances.
If that's a person's consciousness.
Couldn't it also be feel alleviated, like in a balsamic conjunction when something's finishing, even though you may have a sense of sorrow, also it's like taking a big weight out of your back if it's been a hard aspect?
Yes. Yeah, and then there's joy. Every while. So, other
Can you calculate the aspect of the planets like the ascendant and the midheaven? And then which one would you use as when you're looking at an aspect of a planet to the ascendant or the midheaven, which do you use as the stationary point?
well, they have their own motion. As you know, the ascendant moves roughly 1 degree every 4 minutes. So you have to figure out the motion.
If you are in comparison with the other person's sun in synastry, which one would you pick at center if the sun is supposed to be the center?
Because you're going to talk about composites?
No, like synastry rather.
What's the question?
when you want to see, when you do synastry and you compare the faces of one person with the other, which person's son are you gonna?
Yeah, start with the slower, the one that, like, say somebody's son in Taurus, next one's in Leo. Which comes first? That's how you determine the face.
Okay, that's one that comes first. Okay, thank you.
So, now we'll get into any other questions. Wunderbar. Now we'll get into key planetary pairs, and the ones we're going to be considering are Sun, Moon, Saturn, Mars, of course, and Mercury, Jupiter, Jupiter, Saturn, and Uranus. Now these key planetary pairs all correlate, obviously, with archetypes in our consciousness. And now by understanding the entire 360 balsamic, we're going to have a way of understanding how these archetypes operate in consciousness independent of house and sign. So first you can understand how typically, i.e. sun, moon, whatever, etc. And then once you understand that, what you're going to add onto it after that core understanding is made is the actual house and sign of the two particular planets being considered. Add to it. And that will then give you the detail of how the archetype underneath it specifically manifests. So we'll do some examples and all that. So the first one we want to consider, of course, is Sun, Moon. Sun is giving you, correlates, obviously, to how you are integrating your life and giving purpose and meaning to it, and how you go about creatively actualizing whatever your personal sense of purpose is. Sun. It's a lifelong issue. It's how you're integrating and giving purpose to everything that you are, even your soul's purpose. And the moon, in relationship to the sun, remembering that it is correlating with the egocentric formation within consciousness, that gives you a sense of personal identity. This is me. And a way of living with yourself on a moment-to-moment daily basis, through which you feel secure. Moon. So the sun-moon combination simply correlates to the process of creative self-actualization and how you go about that. The actual phase determines how you do it. So if I have a sun-moon, let's say in a first quarter phase, we've just learned first quarter phase, the key word was crisis and action. You could make a simple deduction in this moment of how archetypically a sun-moon person first quarter goes about creatively actualizing on a lifetime basis their sense of personal purpose. How they do this on a day-to-day basis. What kind of structures do they create in order to feel secure in order to do so? Who can make a simple analysis here? Bzz, time's up. Booby prize.
Well, wouldn't it be a person that would want to adopt the existing normalcy of consensus, but then feel that they have all this new found information, but want to now integrate in their own unique way, but has that tendency to want to adopt and to go back and forth on their integration?
First, let's understand how it operates typically independent of evolutionary conditions. because the archetype operates at all levels of evolution. Then you qualify it by the evolutionary condition. But right now, let's determine archetypically how it operates in all people.
Would this be a person that would really be full of themselves, and they would act somewhat instinctively still, but yet would be centered around themselves, their desires, what they want? They would rationalize and justify how their desire is what should be happen.
No.
No.
Work more with the thought of an intense need at whatever level of evolution to creatively actualize himself in some sort of individualistic way. Work with that thought. Stalling? There's no stalling.
Would it be somebody who would identify with or get his identification out of what he's doing? Would be somebody who gets his self-identity by the things he's doing, he's creating, he's somehow acting out.
That's true, but something actually comes before that. That involves the very words that Rudyard created, crises in action. And what did we learn in this phase? The person has following a new phase conjunction, coming out of crescent, this new evolution started here, which on an egocentric individual basis, the person is fully aware of here, which is now the crisis in action. How do I find a form or a direction in life that allows for this individuality to be? This is what the crisis in action is about. So what you have in that phase, sun, moon, in the early part of life, the person will typically experiment with a diversity of directions and forms. The underlying motivation is elimination. It's not this. It's not this. It's not this. And pretty soon, hopefully, they can find it. But through the initial traveling down this path for a bit, taking that road a little while, etc. Soon getting on. And then once they find, oh, this feels most closely to me, then what you have said applies.
Oh, I see. So they find their identity by error.
Trial and error.
They have a fear or insecurity of being trapped into something. Would they need to be trying new things because they're afraid that if they pick one thing that's the wrong thing, they'll be trapped there?
Right.
And they want to keep. So is there a constant need to keep changing, something that feels good? Do they have this, what if I end up doing this?
Unless whatever their choice then can within that choice to promise for growth versus some static reality. And that's the way you want to deal with that kind of client. If you link it to a function, for example, make sure that job function has the potential for expansion, evolution, that it's not a dead-end street.
Jeffrey, when you're dealing with someone like in this state, like you're talking about, how would they know that so they could feel secure with their decisions that they're making? Would it be, change your body? Does it feel right to you? I mean, how would you speak to them about them knowing if they have this ultimate fear of being pinned in, locked in, like that? How would you speak to them?
You want to develop a dialogue that that has the effect of making them aware. If you link with a job function, if they feel that they're distant from the function, if so, how distant? If not, how close? This is how you measure it. The distance factor, the emotional distance. Good morning. Let's make a break. The moon archetype is a very, very critical archetype because of itself it correlates with what? The initial overall imprinting of our early environment at birth. Mama and Papa, Moon, Saturn. And what the phasal relationship, because we are imprinted early environment obviously shapes and defines not only your sense of self, and your emotional reality as a result, but also your world view, Saturn. And it's a way of looking at it. It's going to go about actualizing their own sense of egocentric identity in the context of the world, Saturn, that they are living within. And how a lot of this is shaped and defined, imprinted at birth. I mean, most intuitively know whatever the total picture of our early environment is, how Mama and Papa are relating, how a child is going to take that in 100%. Children do not have barriers. It's like a wide open gate. So, of itself, the phasal relationship tells you what is happening, what's been happening, at an energetic, emotional, psychological level between parents. And how that has imprinted. Let's say we're in Saturn in a full phase. Would it be a leap in logic? Parents were in a state of polarization at that level in some way. They worked with one another. And if that's the imprint, how's that going to shape the person's inner reality as a child? Their sense of identity, their emotional content. That follow through and they become an... Is it likely that they would have their own adult relationship in which they themselves became polarized relative to the adult partner? Be an extension of the early imprint as an example.
Would it make the child withdraw? Like, when it's a child viewing all this polarization, the child withdraw within himself?
That's the final outcome. What typically happens in the beginning is that the child is running back and forth to each parent to make it okay. And a childlike way trying to put the parents together. What an imprint. And the child in a scenario will, in a conscious way, think that they're the source of the problem. So what does the imprint know?
Does the child get like a sense of powerlessness because they can't fix it?
Yes. So what you're imprinting, call it emotional psychology. And as they become an adult, they defeat themselves trying to do something. See how it works there? Right. Tough past life.
Black dog really fits to the Pluto
Oh. Sorry. I'd rather do this.
That's a good way to do astrology. Teach astrology.
A tale of abandonment. So what you're seeing there is that because the original imprint, a person's set of emotions and adult realities that have the effect of opposing who they actually are. And that's why psychology of self-defeat will come out of it. You're getting a feeling for what these Then we get into Mars, Venus, and of course you have the two archetypes involved. You have Mars in the sense of we all have an instinctual feeling of being in a perpetual state of becoming. We all have this feeling. That is your Mars function. It does reflect via the lower vibration of Pluto, i.e. lower octave. It's the archetype in which we subjectively or instinctively act upon the evolutionary desires emanating from the soul. That also requires enough circumstantial freedom in order to be able to initiate whatever experiences you feel necessary with no interference by anybody. But on the other hand, requiring that we complete most people, that we complete ourselves in the context of a relationship. So what we now have is just this, the archetype of how somehow I'm going to be able to create a reality that honors my need to develop myself as an individual, and yet at the same time my need to fulfill or complete myself via relationship. And the meaning therein, the value associations because of, ways of relating because of that. So the Mars-Venus phase then determines what is going to be done. Say Mars-Venus in a disseminating phase. What would that look like? Who would come up with a deduction there?
Creating the normalcy of consensus as far as society and being able to sustain that a relationship that's defined by the society in which the soul lives.
Or even at the more advanced states of evolution. They'll say the person's in an individuated state or a spiritual state, but they're not buying into the system to start with. So how would we understand a disseminating Mars, Venus in that context?
They'd now be taking the information that they have gained on an individual state, meaning specific to themselves and not with what society is considering normal, but still being able to integrate their values and what is important to them with their existing relationship or relationships that they seek of like mind. People are at the same point or kind of kept in the same cloth, so to speak.
That's right. That's what would happen. And they're in a system they feel alienated from, yet somehow they're able to sustain themselves anyway because of the disseminating phase, and then also find a partner who is of like mind to help them be that way. And vice versa. Exactly what would happen.
And there's like a social vision or something, there's a giving to society, giving back to society, would somebody with this aspect feel a need to maybe help with relationships or a model or...
They can be, for sure. Absolutely. What if we put Mars, Venus, say in a full phase, where they're actually opposed? I just want to see the effort. I don't care if you're right or wrong.
Full phase, is that what you said?
Would there on the one hand be a desire for freedom, complete freedom, and on the other hand a desire for a partner which will provide an equal co-relationship?
So what it starts with is what's called an emotional paradox. That are equally strong. On one side of the paradox is an absolute need. On the other side of the paradox, an absolute need for relationship. And this creates a tremendous paradox, obviously. So what typically happens The individual will initiate a diversity relationships early. Will find bits and pieces of its own need in this partner, that partner, that partner, versus finding the whole ball of wax in one partner. There's an unconscious or instinctual way of guaranteeing an exit point, either doing the exiting or being exited. Else come. That's the opposite.
But it's probably somebody who never feels complete if there is not a partner.
No, they can have cycles where they develop an inner relationship to themselves.
Will those partners they attract typically the people who like oppress their freedom?
To
Want their freedom?
oppose their freedom?
Yeah, will they attract partners who kind of want to...
Yeah, sure. Mm-hmm. That's one of the effects. Doesn't that create the rationale? So that works.
Just want to be just a bit.
Isn't there also like a pull between, oh, well, they need me to help them, yet I want to be alone? Could this be like an enabler personality? Would there be times where they find themselves trapped in a relationship that they feel victimized by, but they feel like they need to stay type of feeling?
That can be one of the effects. You can also have an effect of extremity. In a sense, and this is where you want to start qualifying it by the specific nature of the soul and also the houses and signs of the Mars-Venus. Because in some cases it can correlate with an absolute giver. So the security is dependent on the need to be needed. The other extreme where the person wants to be utterly given to. But in most cases there's a simple conflict between the souls giving and receiving relationship, which tend to fluctuate to extremity. They can also create partners whose reality is in diametric opposition to actual reality. And that becoming its own causative factor for termination. They can attract partners or they can be the partner, which maximum projection is being made because of the obvious situation going back to their own early environment. This also is reflected in their own parents in terms of how the parents were in relationship and the giving and receiving, the natures of realities. See, most people don't, most astrologers don't realize that. I mean, it's a magic thing to do in astrology, but once you truly understand the three real strong combinations in synastry, Mercury, Venus, Mars, this will correlate with almost what I would call the daily content that exists in a relationship. You know what I mean by that? And that's kind of, you can see this through Mars, Venus, Mercury. Especially when you start on, like we learned last time, this thing called planetary nodes. And you start utilizing all nodes. And particularly to understanding the relationship between people's mutual south nodes of Venus, mutual south nodes of Mars, line up the current Mars-Venus, the north nodes of these 2 points. You will see in incredible detail, just in those symbols, but the content, what they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. You won't, most astrologers don't know that.
So, is there a program for the
Solar fire. I mean, if you were doing a synastry and you saw two people that conjunct in Scorpio, what would you imagine the content would be? Who could imagine what the content would be? Huh? They are.
Highly charged emotional, sexual relationship where they're like
It would be a compelling soul force that is aimed at metamorphical transformations, psychological, soul content, but that which is deep. And so if you know that, you see what I mean? There's content. You understand what I mean, yeah? Mercury, Jupiter. This is going to correlate with how the person inwardly thinks, number one, the actual nature of their thinking process, how they think, how they communicate about what they think, and their ability to take in or learn external information. All finally manifesting as their worldview by way of their philosophy. How they are putting together reality from a phenomenal point of view, putting it together through intellectual constructions, equaling a philosophical structure. Call it belief. And therefore how they're going to interpret life relative to that structure. So, let's say we make Mercury, Jupiter in a gibbous phase. Yours? No. Who can put that together? What just do with one part of that equation? How would they inwardly think? How does their thinking mechanism work?
Lack.
Would be some very analytic. Is looking for to improve maybe to improve details in a larger context.
It's a larger context that makes confusion because of the emphasis. You see? Okay.
That'd be very self-critical.
They'd be very self-critical.
And critical of others, probably. Philosophy.
Yes.
But they affect their own.
Right.
The feeling that constantly needing to search for more diversity, search for more ideas, better ideas. What I have isn't enough, isn't sufficient, I lack the totality of knowledge, so there's got to be more out there to look for, and you just keep find that.
You're speaking from experience?
This is the perfect philosophy.
The perfect philosophy, yeah.
People also think very differently.
I'm sorry?
People think very different. They feel like they don't need to normal school to I don't know. I know somebody with that, and like
Different?
yeah, they're very good at learning by themselves, but not in the conventional school.
That would then be determined by the actual houses and signs. But within the archetype, describing now by way of the archetype, is thinking that normal ways of learning are not sufficient, i.e. an emphasis on lack, gibbous, which then is manifesting through their houses and signs as a thought, I need to be in specialized education.
Isn't it somebody who thinks, if I finally find all the details, I will understand the whole, and is frustrated not knowing enough details?
Right. That's the...
Could they also doubt their own intuition unless they could later analyze the intuition and make it logical sequentially?
Yes, but you have to remember that Jupiter is still applying to Mercury in this combination. So in essence, the right brain is still the applicable point. It's trying to lead the left brain. But in the gibbous phase, they are now doubting their strength. Saturn, Jupiter. So when we start getting into these outer phases now, these outer planets, we start developing generational applications. So what the Saturn-Jupiter means from a collective view is whatever the prevailing consensus thought is about anything, religion, worldviews, politics, etc. So all souls are born, of course, at a particular moment in time and imprint whatever the current relationship is between Saturn and Jupiter. That's what they're imprinting, and therefore whatever the existing nature is of the prevailing consensus thinking, philosophically. And how that imprint of itself, unconsciously, shapes their own philosophical worldview as they become an adult Saturn. And whatever that worldview is, will of itself determine Saturn how they're able to integrate themselves as an individual into the context of the overall world. This can also have, the economic implications. The Saturn-Jupiter thing, economically, it works like clockwork. I mean, every time you have a new phase conjunction of these two things, and you link it at a collective political level, you will always find world or political leaders manifesting who will then offer some sort of new economic vision with respect to that which has become crystallized, i.e. balsamic. This works at 20-year intervals, and it comes to a head every 10 years. That's the opposition point. And you can just track this, for those here in America, just track through American history. Reagan came up when it was a Saturn, Jupiter, new phase conjunction. And all of a sudden you hear this bizarre word called Reaganomics. And the whole trickle-down theory. Remember that one? And you're standing up on a TV with a shrinking dollar and promising we'd have balanced budget in 2 years, and we just had to make the wealthy more wealthy, and we all benefit through trickle down. Yeah.
It's a really shrinking dollar bill.
Yeah. He was comparing it to what Carter had done.
This is a new phase chart, May 2000. May 2000, the next Saturn, sort of that goes on.
But I mean, look at bottom line, and whatever economic condition you're born into. So I'm born in 1920s Deutschland. Quite an infant, Or if I'm born in 1930s, infant people.
What was that in like 60, 61? There was a conjunction of Saturn and Jupiter in 60.
That's what's called President Kennedy. So these things, this is a very important phase, and all you have to do is understand the underlying archetypes and understand the imprint. Looking at the phases or the planets is one's personal philosophy of life. How is your personal philosophy of life in relationship to the overall society that you're living within? But if your particular philosophy has nothing to do with the nature of the existing societal reality, I've now created a Jupiter effect called alienation. If so, if I move towards the psychology of alienation, But it's then the reverse impact on my ability to sustain myself economically. You see what I mean now? Then we have Saturn Uranus, and this here is a 48-year cycle, conjunction to conjunction. It comes to maturity 20 to 24 years after the original conjunction. This has an 8-year life relative to each phase. So then you're looking at sub-generations within generations. And what it is groupings of people then act out. For example, there was a conjunction of these two, I think around 1942 in Taurus. They came to maturity, guess what, in the late 60s. And what do you have? You have many dimensions of Taurus. One dimension of Taurus is the phenomena of music. Now look how this grouping born then. Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, the Beatles, blah blah. Developed Saturn Uranus, a new form. It was revolutionary in nature relative to Saturn. These people came to maturity in the late 60s. And how did then everyone else in that 8-year time frame, 1942 through 19 or so, who share in that phase, how is it then when the icons, in this case the musicians, made this sort of music, and they had the effect of creating a contagion effect, Uranus, amongst that very same subgrouping, by listening to music, which then ignited their own soul structure. It is now called the late 60s, i.e. hippies. You see how it works? So we have this impact at these conjunctions, and it's acted out relative to phase. What's interesting, by way of that's Uranus. What groupings of people are you imprinting with? Not through like-mindedness. New phase conditions, Saturn Uranus, the courage, new phase, to break free, Saturn Uranus, from all the existing and old forms called reality, at every level, even in terms of how parenting was conducted. Got divorced. You understand that point? What's interesting, another conjunction here in the late, I believe it was 88, and what's so in this last conjunction, it took place at exactly 28 degrees of Sagittarius, which is the center of our galaxy. And we have to remember that the underlying archetype of Sagittarius is natural law, Gaia, the totality of nature. Here's one of your symbolisms. Because remember, when Uranus is active, it accelerates anything. And this is why it had a progressive acceleration in the deterioration of the environment called Earth with respect to violation of law. And if you first see this in the atmosphere, Uranus. You see what I mean or not? The very air you breathe.
It hasn't come to fruition about 2012.
That's guess whose calendars. Coincidence? mostly been made in its biased wisdom. In any case, there's a certain kind of cloud that only manifests now in your Arctic regions. It's a very rare kind of cloud that reflects. The cloud is produced by the interaction of the various stratospheres and the exchange of cold air and warm air. And this occurs, this cloud is produced. It's a cloud that if you saw it in a dark night sky would have its own inner luminosity. It's like neon, and it's silver and within the last weeks they have found these clouds over Colorado and Utah. This is one of the first indications of the acceleration of the deterioration of our atmosphere, thus planet. Acceleration. The geologist who observed it in his own words, this is his word, I was shocked. Because they had no expectation to find it. And he just casually observed, he was this outside guy on his porch, looked up and there it was.
What is the physical effect of these clouds? What is the physical effect or context of these clouds?
The consequence is an acceleration, deterioration in the integrity of every stratosphere within the atmosphere.
So the projection of the Earth is...
Its balance is being lost. Its integrity is being down. The lines of separation are being broken. Increased radiation is the effect.
Yeah. And they're still reinforcing that by projects like the HARP project and stuff like that.
Right. That's crazy.
If we're being exposed to more radiation, is there something that we might need to be doing?
There's a few compounds that one can take to throw off the effect of, not even the effect, it doesn't allow the radiation to be assimilated. Because radiation is assimilated through your thyroid. So, there's a couple homeopathics that have the effect of washing whatever radiation you do integrate out of you. And over time tends to create a barrier and a barrier around the thyroid. One remedy is uranium oxide. Another one is called BAWN, next word, MAU, Bon Mont.
They have the yarrow formula. So it's very good.
Another way to go around this is because iodine will also have a very positive effect in the thyroid by way of blocking excessive intake of radiation. So if you just add a little of iodine to your drinking water,
You could use this too?
kelp is good.
That's probably we could do it in New York too. Cancer from New York and we always like all the kind of candidates. I never knew why he did. And he couldn't even answer the question because it's good for you. Like those things putting up water.
Well, the two uranium, the homeopathics were actually developed by a homeopath that I actually know, and he's the guy that developed them, and in the 50s he went out when they did all this open air testing in this country with the atom bombs. This is how he developed the remedy because of all the fallout that was happening. He actually developed remedies on site. So, like a, how do you call it, Nostradamus type. Alchemist. So these are your key planetary pairs. Again, these operate archetypically. It is, when you start doing your birth charts, it's, remember in the beginning of the school I said you can develop a lot of pre-information that gives orientation to the birth chart to actually get into your analysis, i.e. looking for preponderances, remember all that stuff, the preliminary information. This is also preliminary information that you want to look into before you're looking at that chart. It's in your consciousness to that person's actual orientation. And this is why you look at these planetary phases before you actually look at the specific houses and signs that they're in. See how that follows? Yes? No? Any questions on this stuff?
I was just not really touching about that, but we were just talking about the Saturn, the Uranus cycle, and you said that the greatest impact on the environment would be around 2012. A lot of the Pluto and Virgo generation is going to be about 6 and something in 2011, and experiencing their Chiron return.
That's true, and to see you again, you'll see a tremendous acceleration between the years 2003 and 2001. That will be delivered of God, the intent of which is to catch collective attention, so that hopefully choices can be made in those 2 critical years that can have the effect of impacting on the potential severity that ultimately occurs. Because at that point, Pluto even shifts to Capricorn. Earth.
In what year?
Pluto shifts to Capricorn.
In 2012.
2011. And you put Pluto in Capricorn in history and the speak for.
What about the May 5th, 2000 that everybody's been talking about, where everything's all in line, and they're saying, and I saw this videotape that I just for kicks, and it was talking about this guy. Now they're saying, and I didn't agree, but the solar caps, because of the force of the energy that it does.
Sorry.
It's already changing. We're already feeling its effects right now, and I agree that it's going to be a slow, steady change up until.
That date correlates with the birth of the last Antichrist. The actual occurred May 4th.
The last Antichrist, who was that?
It hasn't been born, it'd be born then.
Oh, I see.
And the individual's going to be born almost a different way, outside a place called in Turkey. And the individual will be a Kurd. No, I can't tell you more than that.
But the other guy's still alive.
Blonde Ben Laden? Yes, he is.
He lives alive.
Not too much longer.
So much to handle.
He's the wealthy Saudi Arabian, the ones that attacked the entire Western world. He's the second one. First one was Hitler.
Doesn't seem to be doing as much damage as Hitler.
That's because he is shitless, because the United States is all over this guy. They have their tentacles everywhere, which are substantial. This guy's living like a caged animal right now. I mean, the evil that's in consciousness is... Oh, well, let's talk about other things. Any other questions on this stuff here?
But can you also consider, and not have good success on some charts. For example, like the moon Saturn. But if I go to the ruler of the 4th and the ruler of the 10th, I see much more accurate information that the client agrees with, using the phases, but using the rulers of those two archetypical moon Saturn houses.
No, and that's probably the way you're not presenting it quite right to where the client can get it. And these are the underlying archetypes, number one. And then you add to that. So it's just, you'll see as you develop more in astrology, the systematic I really work with it in each. I mean that you really have to understand the context. Any other questions? Yeah, so we're perfectly clear. Okay, now is our relationship stuff.
Jeffrey, can I ask you a quick question not related to this?
Sure.
I've been, reading through the really in question about the whole natural thing. And when the last natural was established in place, what was going into the patriarchy, what was it that was necessary for the growth at that point that that people needed when it shifted? I'm just curious because it's going into that.
I understand. The answer is God seeking its own perfection through evolution. And the principles, as long as you have a duality of creation, you have the active principles of male and female. Mm-hmm. God discovers his own perfection through its own evolution, through alternating the dominant as a dominant principle, or female or male. Mm-hmm. Is what's underlying this transition that occurred around starting in 6500 BCE. That's why. That's what it's about.
So now I'm just resurfacing again. Is it coming up more as a balance too?
That's what really happened here on Earth. Remember that the vastness of the totality of the creation is beyond anything the human mind can even comprehend. The totality of the creation is the totality of God. And if you can only human comprehend 2/10,
So do you feel that
that's about it. That much.
what was this trans?
Duality will never be left behind.
Well, not that we're leaving it. We're merging more into a oneness with that male female, and then to take that 2, 3, 4 of the new head.
It's not. It's even false to use the word matriarchy.
It's trying to, because it can't be something that was obvious.
For how the human organism is living time on this planet seems to be living through, defined by laws of nature. Women, from the point of view, this is why matriarchy. Natural living.
I feel like we're moving toward like something more.
But not.
I don't know.
It is where time where that is real. Even patriarchal transition happened. Because this thing that you call matriarchy, I mean, in the European continent, it died out really 500 BCE, and southwest of Monshan, but an island called Krita. That's because it's next to the mainland. This thing that was called natural survived until the 4th century AD. And you can go to Krita even now and see the artifacts. That's what it's saying. Da-da. Krita. Sounds good. Yeah, sure, exactly. That's a good sign of things to come.
With all the changes that are in this evolutionary process, what is there of possibility of Lemur and Atlantis?
No, that's all crap. Sorry. Just all crap is people's invention. There is the thing called this. It's the outer. It was even in Plato's own writings. It's still there. You can go walk on it. It just happened to be small. But there is a little ring of rock that is the remnants of Atlantis. Actual Atlantis. And people, you know, glorify it, make these statements and that statement, and
Isn't that what Atlantis
come on.
is? Isn't that real? Isn't that real architecture?
Yeah, it became during Leo's.
Why did it perpetuate wanting to be glorified? We're strong back there.
Well, in historical times, it's referred to as the Golden Age, Leo. You know, and there was a time people were still.
But did it become really too
It was ultimately destroyed relative to the patriarchal transition. And that's because the people there became progressively contaminated through patriarchal distortion. And we finally ended up happening, sort of like a Zor masses. And to keep those masses enslaved, they started performing what, in our terminology, is to lobotomies, the masses were enslaved. And technologies of magnetic resonance and polarity. There was even the beginning of flying machines then, based on polarity coming off the Earth. But it was through this violation of natural law and this incredible perversion of slave water, the blowing up of Atlantis, the volcanic explosion.
Robert Hancock talks about that in his book too.
That in time.
It was blown up. It was right 6500 BC.
So Atlantis had a society that was pretty similar to the structure of Sparta.
Yeah. But it even intensified 1,000 times. That's why it had to get itself.
Spartans left their baby.
Yeah. Nice people, huh?
Was Lemuria, was that?
No, Lemuria, frankly, is an illusion. Never existed. Except. I've made a mess of it here. What's that?
At some point you said you could be
Yeah, at some point. Let's have a, yeah.
As we evolve more and more towards natural law, it's going to be at a... It's going to be going older. Versus what it was when you go through all this.
So it'll be a matter of what's happening is that because of relation to natural laws, I mean, setting emotional law, there's incredible vibration within nature that equals at almost every level of reality, starting with the genetic code of life at every level.
That also
That's exactly what radiation does. It mutates. You know, even in the worst case scenarios, most, you know, you could imagine a cataclysm. And then, at least in the current time, the extinction of human species is in fact not at hand. Even in the worst case scenarios, it would be roughly 30% survival. I mean, this is the magic of God to me, that it's what Jesus taught, that the last shall come first. And what that literally means is that people whose consciousness is still structured, the principle, in our times. They're the ones that get shook because the norm is people defined by self-interest. Together. Consciousness, structure, sharing, and inclusion. It becomes the original rebirth point. You see what I mean? So that the model reality scenario is possible. Life with natural law. That's how it's going to come down.
Is it not also the fact that people become more by that, because the more find asked by that, so it's a positive process.
Right. And then when, you know, this issue of mutation, it creates a set of apparent natural, because relative to that then means different planet.
And you say these people with lessons for all the contribute to, ideally come out of that with
Attunement with it. That's why in natural religions, everything's done through direct perception. There's nothing to believe in except natural.
peanut butter. And the oil. Or ice. Ice or peanut butter. Like rubber, right?
Well, we saw time. At this point, we to shift our time.
To a degree of intensity. Certain things have been unsaid to change based on prior collective choices. Starting with your Western teach human person, period, is meant servant. Sadism and masochism. Well, finally nature is reacting.
And also saw a lot of the real take magic and stuff. Reminding of no, I'm serious. It's just gonna be like you don't really care about them. And like it's their own ego thing. Look, that's what's that.
Okay, so let's start moving into our relationship now. Talk relationship type or typings. And here again we have to understand this in order to account the text by relationship typings. There's a variety of typings. One type, the prevailing type in our times, is called codependent. Another typing is called S&M, sadomasochistic typing. Counselor typing. And you have as a type. Within those typings, we also to deal with. And that's the issue of same soul, soulmates. Use determination in order to understand what we're looking at astrologically. The code type means just that. People have dependency, working on others to supply their individual needs. The word of this is a statement we've all heard. I cannot live with. It's rather melodramatic, isn't it? What a pathetic condition. I'm sorry. And of course, this is the real cause of what we can call conditional love. I will love you if. That's not real love, is it? Unfortunately, your relationships in Western countries are codependent. That's the current relationship cultural model. The self-reliant typing in times like this are extremely rare. What this means are two people prior to their coming together, who have already learned to look within and have already learned to identify their own needs. By coming together, they will have a mutual that is a Mars-like attitude, i.e., I just want to be with you because I want to be with you, not because of need or compulsion, not what you can do for me. Now, self-reliant type, the only time you can real self-reliant, real. I'm not any here, I can take care of myself. That's an artificial self-reliance that is created through anger and fear of intimacy. Real self-reliance occurs when an individual truly ultimate relationship. That is where the meaning
Here with the jet.
will can only occur when you're married to the inner God. When you've made all of your needs met there. Or to imagine. Good. So once you have this ultimate relationship, obviously your is going to be completely different. There's calls for unconditional love out. Then those two partners simply support, facilitate each other's individual process. Not trying to crush it, manipulate it, or do
One type turns to another. Can one there was a codependent relationship complete design?
Sure. Thank God. It seems that way. The common is the famous and the counselor counselee the content that is specific and unique to this type. Content intense is that the role of the counselor sets themselves within, talk, teach, and they present themselves as containing some level of knowledge of an emotional, psychological nature, metaphysically. It's emotion their own, and that, and that vibration, that the causative or the attracting, who we can now call the counselee. Counselee will be a person who has a series of problems. In their vibration says, I cannot solve these things myself. Thus setting in motion a dependency on the counselor. These two types come. But you should counselee, counselor, as the majority of these types, 95% or so, The reason that they have become what appears to be 95% of these people de-emphasize fear, emotional seeking, of loss, betrayal, and abandonment, impacting on how they're able to be intimate with somebody. Based on I attract somebody to myself, and here now becomes the key word, who appears more needy than myself. Become the counselor. My subconscious, this guarantee, based on the emotional, psychological role. The subconscious is saying, this person needs me. And that sets in motion this false sense of security. But the problem is typically maintains the relationship for the duration of the need. And once that need is relatively satisfied, no longer a need. So what the counselor will find again is that there's no security in that role because the counselee will leave. So it recreated the wound anyway. Is the domain of the parent-child. And it must be a counselor child. Talking about himself, adult.
They relate like
Yeah. Yeah, okay.
some days the child grows up.
That's right. Bye-bye.
A lot of people want professional status.
You got it. Right. You bet. That's what it's a transfer because of the dynamic. See how it works? Well, they're transferring to one another. That ultimately happens to the counselor when this become at some point the counselee. Naturally happens.
So the changes the air vibration. And whether it be relationship or astrologer.
Now, variation of student teacher, the difference is that, and what we call a student teacher, is that the teacher in this situation is teaching the individual about all of life, just a specific content. This is the parent business. But the reasons are the same. Even the teacher will have in varying degrees of intensity this fear of loss, abandonment, betrayal. Thus they said, of course, the student in that scenario all too often has had a horrible childhood. So they're looking for a de facto parent. Of course, this is S&M. The overt masochism are recognizable by all of us. Pathologies in almost anybody's relationship. Not so overt. The overt forms equal the battered wife scenario and the scenario.
What's happening is that women who get beaten and then try to get their children out of the situation and they apply for shelter, they're getting bad parents. That's what's happening. They're getting bad parents because they have put their child in a situation.
Right. The mind, isn't it?
And the children get taken.
Or the counselor cases, evolutionary different as far as consciousness or teaching, or is it?
Nature of the evolution discrepancy is common. Counselor and at this level. It can appear that way, but in reality, an issue of the already been or done or known. Clearly many forms of S&M in various types of relationships, and let's cite a few examples. Not an uncommon example. Let's say somebody withholds sexual attention from their partner for some specific reason. That's a sadistic act. What happens in a relationship in which the male's reality is somehow supposed to be more important than the female reality? That's sadomasochistic. You can even have this manifest through, how many of you have been subjected to what appears to be teasing? But when the teasing is actually abusive. Do you understand what I'm getting at? It's the issue as an apparent joke, but it's actually meant to be something else. That kind of teasing. There's many forms of this stuff.
You can see it very often. Parents don't get along with their children.
Right. The putting down of one another. This is sadomasochistic.
Like typical adolescent behavior.
Yeah. At another level of society here in America, man, woman does the same job, woman makes 30% less. Does that not say? Goes right back to superiority and inferiority. Think about it. They're doing the identical job. For the famous glass ceiling for female doctors. They can only climb a certain level within the hospital. Sure. Sure. There's a medical person, ask her.
I had a friend who had a real daughter that she wanted to be a doctor, and she was extremely bright, and they, it's a lot of competition, and she was in this really good school, and they told her, well, you're just going to get married and have kids anyway, so we're going to give it to this man. And she fought it. And she got to do that.
It's a male-oriented profession, and they're trying to keep the females out of administration levels, because that's where are made. Right. Versus how many men are nurses. Starting to. But you know what? The bullshit in this, who's the guy that made this great oath? Hippocrates, or this medical guy? When you take the oath? What they don't have on their, wherever the plaque, where they have the statement, they don't have the whole statement. He went on to say, and only person who can really do true medicine is also an astrologer.
Really?
This is his own quote. Read the history. He was an astrologer.
Who is this? I missed the name. Hippocrates?
Yeah, that guy. And you don't see this part of the quote there, do you? Next time you talk to a doctor who wants to put down astrology, remind him of the quote. You watch the eyeballs go right. That's because historically it's been... Of course. This is called revision. So then you have to look at these typings and make the appropriate observation. You're oriented as a choice. The issue of same soul, soulmates, and so forth. Of not that they don't exist, but it's very, very... soulmate, I mean, people, depends on your definition of what a soulmate is. Definition is in Jesus taught. To Jesus are two people who have independently spiritualized their life. And the only way to be together is to enhance and expand on individual spiritual development because of and through the relationship. Does not mean they're perfect. It means they have the same bottom line. This allows for line equaling. Most people get confused. Again, 90% of the people we meet in any given life, we have known in some capacity prior to the current life. And that's because, relative to evolutionary purposes, it takes more than one life to accomplish what those purposes are. And thus, this is why we attract people we've met before, which have all been part of prior so to speak, facilitating the actualization and realization of that evolutionary purpose. So, most people are in relationship to in some fashion, and what we can literally call karma mates. Karma. This is very different than soulmate. Karma means two people have had past life association in some way, they're not yet finished. That is the majority of contacts. Soul means, because again for many people have been taught that when you reach a certain degree of evolution, the soul then has the capacity to generate what appears to be the appearance of one person, i.e. different egos. You've always been taught that at that level of evolution, the soul will do that in order to accelerate separating, and so on. But there's another situation around the same soul, in which certain souls have a high degree of inner conflict, but the very nature of the intensified conflict requires that the soul set itself out into the appearance of other men in order to know the very nature of its desires, which are
That's anyway, whatever. And the conflict is prior to
let me go find it again.
Never mind.
What?
This is some kind of embodied schizophrenia.
It could appear that way.
I feel like,
No, the maximum is 3.
Is there someone who's struggling with polar extremality where they would experience two conflicting?
No, that's a psychological issue based on unresolved trauma.
They're not conflicting desires, but
Desires that are so diametrically opposed to one another.
Okay, so they're not that they're opposite, but that they're just totally different.
They can also appear as opposite based on the nature of opposition.
Like you want to go down one road, you want to go down another road, you can't
Right,
do that.
exactly.
would that show up in the chart as to what those different desires are?
Sure.
How would you look at that?
You just put, well, first you have to locate the different souls in question. Different people in question.
How can you identify it? How can you identify if that person...
You can't astrologically. You have to do observation.
Do they recognize each other?
Absolutely.
To their left,
Absolutely.
they hate each other.
Both. It's literally both. Because after all, the original nature of the conflict generates the answer. But that's if the soul repulsed against itself. In fact, it split itself off in 3 different forms. What happens when the parent people begin to re-meet? You meet at the point of first place. And that creates the attraction and repulsion.
How to look at that in the chart.
Look at the chart. It'll show you.
So we'll be looking at the 2 charts. What are the areas that are in squares, opposition?
Yeah, it's just the overall nature of the chart. I mean, let's say that, for example, let's say the soul, one part of the soul structure wanted just absolute alignment with God. But let's say another part of the within that soul wanted, I want hedonism. This is going to be directly. So, what happens now when they, you see it, and you can see that in the chart. What's that? Well, maybe that had no awareness of it.
You said it can get to right up to 3 can it be possible that a person gets the two in one and the other one just one? You see what I mean?
No.
You said that there's a round circle shape that's dividing into three.
Three.
Is there a possibility that it can only divide like
No.
in two?
No, it's three or nothing. Yeah. The natural spiritual law of the Trinity.
Can the chart reflect just the individual fractured part, or it reflects the intention before the fracture?
I didn't hear all.
Does the chart reflect, if you have the chart of somebody who's one of these things, that person's chart shows just them, that piece of you.
The whole soul.
It'll show the whole. Have you ever dealt with that?
Yes, absolutely. And see what's interesting is when you're at these 500-year points in history before the beginning of an age, these become critical moments in history. Because you have something culminating and something beginning. So when an age begins to culminate, souls who have in fact separated, when ages start to culminate, must try to come back together, the parts back. And I would say, given, because I lecture everywhere, that in the last 5-6 years maybe, actually it's longer now, 8 or 9, I'm going to date myself. I've had much increasing observation of this phenomenon in all countries.
What level do you have to be at evolutionary?
Can we do?
Oh, I thought.
No, that's the myth that's what I'm trying to say. In patriarchal reality, they just wanted to know you this part of it. You had to be in an advanced state of evolution. This evolution can occur at any level of evolution. So, so anyway, they're making these observations. The simplest way to know it is, it's like imagine an individual who has the type of life satisfied in every way. They even have a good life partner. But deep, deep inside, there's this existential something they cannot put their finger on. That is one of the shades of a soul that split itself.
Can you have that in the quarter phase too? Within another soul?
Sure.
So that's the problem, how to determine it.
Mm-hmm.
Also, the demon soul came from someplace other than originated.
Daemon? Yes.
They are really a
That's just a...
different kind of.
Yes.
How is that different? How is that?
Because they're not...
I mean, not being told different than the missing.
Twin soul, different issue.
How would you know what they refer?
Tell what?
Somebody's ever had this feeling of lack, this feeling of I'm missing somebody that I can't find. How do you know whether it's...
Because first then you have to ask the person, do you have an inner relationship with God? No, then the missing piece is God. The person has already an interactive life that is full of inner Godhead, and they still have that sense of missingness. That's the soul that's separate. Daemon soul, folks, sit us in the night sky, become one with the light, and you will feel at home.
How would the integration of the same soul come about if there's three of them? How would the integration of the same soul come about?
Hard. Because what happens is that when they meet with respect to the intent of merging back, the original life that would take place be very, very analogous to when a rocket ship wants to come back to Earth. On the one hand, you have the symbol of penetration / merging, but you also have the resistance, the sparks flying off. And that's because there's two reasons. Conflict. Number two, these apparent bodies also goes in them. And thus the fear of what? Dissolving that stupid ego. So typically, at least in the observation so far, what we observed is it takes life to make final merging. The first life that they tried in general, the people might last 6 months to a year. Second life might last 2 to 3 years. Third life they might last 3 to 7 years. There we go.
One criteria to find out is to ask somebody about his connection to God. But you also said that splitting up can be on every level. So if you have somebody in the consent,
They would have to have an active relationship with the external God, going to church, doing the rituals.
I guess if you had one part of the soul that in whatever if they had to become self-sufficient, or that part of that, when merging came back, they would have a really hard time, wouldn't they? If they already were. Never mind.
If I happen to have a client that is this split, and I don't think can I still be of help to them?
Of course. But you can also ask the client if they feel partners, and so when two people are together that are literally the same soul, they know it. Because the two people are perfect mirrors for one another. Perfect mirrors. What they're not liking in their partner is essentially what they've never liked in themselves, and vice versa. And what they like in their partner is also what they like in them. They're perfect mirrors.
To determine the lifetime, how many lives of the two people that are merging together, would you look at the Mars-Venus phase? Would that be an indication of...
It can be an absolute careful. You can tell by the behavior of the couple themselves. Like if you were typically being the same soul of people, two people, and it was the first time, they would actually sit with distance. Compare this to maybe it's the fifth time. Old time.
And then that can also change, because again, that kind of pulling apart, coming together.
At the fifth level, it's not pulling apart anymore. Then there's this issue called twin soul. What this really essentially is are two souls that have been birthed by God at exactly the same point in time. And as a result, their evolutionary journey, given that they were birthed the same moment by God, thus their evolutionary journey has been identical. Twins. Now this is not same soul stuff, it just means two souls that are twins, that have been traveling the same evolutionary journey through time. And twin souls, when they are born, they'll be born within minutes, and another, relatively same locality, within, say, a couple hundred miles. And twin souls, it doesn't matter whether they're male, male, female, female, male, male, can exist at any combination. Twin souls will look identical, or relatively the same, not virtually identical as in virtual twins, but really look the same. They'll have the same thoughts, the same values, the same feelings, the same emotions, the same dreams, all the same, really close, and so on. Twin. No. Sometimes and sometimes not. I'll show you the difference in a minute because you brought up. There's no reason the primary reasons to be in a relationship is for all of us to confront our existing limitations. And by confronting limitations with one another, the intent is to grow beyond them, / evolve. We can only go limitations for counterpoint of know it through the mirror. And this is exactly why in God's law, twin souls are meant to be in any kind of relation. Not. All the charts I've done in this life, which are too many, 20,000 or whatever, they've only got a few actual documented cases of real twin souls actually physically, maybe 30. They just happen to the moment, proximity, and all these things I've told you have all been true, and that's how I learned it, was through observation. And out of that, whatever, one couple actually, and of course they were Leo. So beyond the initial self-glorification and all, the amazing, of course, bored. This flat I got bored. So after the little happy glow was, you know how Leos can go. So, in any case, that's stuff. So these are your basic things that you want to be looking at before you attempt to do a relationship analysis. Again, it's information. It allows you to have right orientation to the charts so that you can then interpret rightly what is going on. That's the point.
Is the same soul today supposed to be in the condition?
Of course.
I'm not clear on the purpose of the twin souls because God...
There is no purpose. That's just Leo doing Leo stuff. Okay, so when we come back from our lunch, then we'll get into more preliminary lunch today in a minute. What's an hour and a half from now? Thing over synastry chart. Before we do that, it is essential when you start doing synastry work, which means, by the way, the dynamics that exist between two people as two people is very different than a composite chart. A chart of two people who have fused, and it creates like a third entity. Sort of like saying